The morning sun always came slow over the fields behind the old farmhouse. The light would crawl over the tall grass, painting everything gold before touching the cracked porch where the old woman sat. Her name was Evelyn Carter. She had lived on that farm since she was a little girl, back when the world moved slower and people knew every neighbor within 10 miles. Her hands were rough, marked with years of planting and picking, but she moved with quiet strength. Every morning she fed the chickens, checked on the goats, and made sure her crops were growing right. The work was hard, but she liked it that way. The rhythm of her days gave her peace. The house was small and worn, but always clean. A faded photo of her late husband sat on the mantel, next to a folded flag and an old Bible. The wooden floors creaked when she walked, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and lavender soap. She didn't have much, but everything she had carried a story. Evelyn's farm sat on the edge of town, a good 10 miles from the nearest store. The road that led there was long and dusty, lined with oak trees that looked older than time. Sometimes people passing through would stop to buy honey or eggs from her roadside stand. Most didn't know much about the woman behind the jars and baskets, just that she lived alone and kept to herself. Every Sunday, she'd drive her old pickup truck to the farmer's market in town. Folks would wave, some calling her Miss Evelyn, others just nodding kindly. She always wore a straw hat and a faded denim jacket, her posture straight even with her age. Kids liked her because she always slipped them a small jar of honey or a handful of boiled peanuts. Adults respected her because she never asked for help but was always the first to give it when someone needed. But behind that calm smile was a quiet watchfulness. Evelyn had lived long enough to know when something wasn't right. It started with little things. One morning she found her garden gate unlatched. She thought maybe she'd forgotten to close it. Then 2 days later, a few hens were missing from the coop. She found feathers near the fence and prints in the dirt. Too big for a fox, too heavy for a raccoon. She frowned but didn't say a word. She just fixed the fence, stronger this time. The next week she noticed a set of tire tracks by the gravel road that led to her barn. They weren't from her truck and they hadn't been there the day before. The ground was soft from rain and she could see where the vehicle had stopped for a moment, then turned back toward the main road. That night, Evelyn sat by the window longer than usual. The moon was full, lighting the fields like silver water. The crickets sang and somewhere far off a dog barked. She didn't feel afraid, just alert, the way a soldier listens when the woods go too quiet. Her neighbor, an older man named Henry who lived a mile down the road, stopped by the next day. He told her that folks in town had been talking about a group of men breaking into barns and empty houses. They stole fuel, tools, and sometimes livestock. Henry warned her to be careful, said the sheriff was already looking for them. Evelyn just nodded. She thanked him for stopping by and offered him a jar of honey before he left. After he drove off, she locked the doors and checked the windows. The house felt smaller that night, and the sound of the wind through the trees seemed sharper. Evelyn wasn't a woman who scared easy. She'd lived through hard times, the kind most people couldn't imagine. She'd lost family, worked through droughts, and faced nights when thunder shook the walls and the crops nearly washed away. But she had always survived. Still, the idea of strangers creeping near her land stirred something deep inside her. She didn't like trouble, but she knew how to handle it if it came her way. As days passed, she carried on as usual. She tended her bees, collected eggs, and sat on the porch in the evenings, sipping sweet tea and listening to the radio. The announcer talked about the weather and local news. Another report about the break-ins, this time closer to her side of town. Evelyn turned the volume down and looked out across the field. The sun was setting behind the woods, throwing long shadows across the grass. Her eyes narrowed slightly, focused on the line of trees at the far edge of the property. For just a moment she thought she saw movement, something or someone slipping between the branches. But when she blinked, it was gone. That night, sleep came slow. She lay in bed, listening to the house settle around her. Every creak and sigh of the old wood sounded louder than usual. The wind pressed against the windows, making the curtains dance. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. She turned on her side, staring at the moonlight spilling across the floor. Her mind drifted back to years long past. Dusty roads, the smell of gun oil, and the sound of distant thunder that wasn't thunder at all. She closed her eyes and pushed the memories away. Those days were long behind her. The next morning, she woke before sunrise. The air was cool and a thin layer of mist hung over the field. She put on her boots and walked out to check the fence again. That's when she saw it, the gate, broken clean off one hinge. She crouched down, fingers tracing the dirt. Fresh tracks, big boots, more than one pair. She could see where they'd come through, walked around the barn, then turned back. She followed the tracks for a few yards before they disappeared into the grass. Evelyn stood up slowly, her face calm but her eyes sharp. She didn't panic. She didn't even frown. She simply nodded to herself as if confirming what she already knew. Trouble had found its way closer. When she went back inside, she didn't reach for the phone. Instead, she made herself a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table thinking. The world outside was quiet again, but that kind of quiet often meant something was watching. She looked toward the hallway, where an old wooden cabinet stood against the wall. It was tall and worn, its surface marked by years of dust and polish. Inside it, behind folded quilts and old photo albums, was something she hadn't touched in years. She stared at it for a long time, then sighed softly and turned back to her coffee. Later that afternoon, a truck slowed down on the road in front of her house. It didn't stop, just rolled by slow enough for her to notice. She stood on the porch, pretending to sweep, her eyes following the vehicle as it disappeared around the bend. She couldn't see the driver clearly, but something about the way they moved made her uneasy. When night came again, she double-checked every lock and left the porch light burning. The farm that once felt like home now carried a weight. Not fear, but tension. Like a storm waiting to break. Over the next few days, the air seemed heavier. She started hearing strange sounds at night. An engine starting far off, then dying. The sound of gravel shifting on the road. Footsteps, maybe, though she could never be sure. Once she found one of her barn doors open in the morning. Nothing was taken, but she knew someone had been there. She didn't call anyone. She just watched. Her eyes, though lined with age, were still sharp. Every night she sat by the window, a cup of tea in her hand, the radio turned low. She kept the lights off inside so she could see out better. The field stretched wide and empty under the moon. And for the first time in years, Evelyn felt that old stillness come back. The kind that came before action. She remembered what it felt like to wait for danger, to listen for footsteps that didn't belong. It wasn't fear she felt. It was readiness. The people in town went about their business, not knowing that the quiet old woman at the edge of the county was preparing in her own way. Not with calls or alarms, but with patience. She fixed her fences again, this time reinforcing them with steel wire. She stacked sandbags behind the barn wall, saying it was to stop the soil from washing out. But she knew better. To anyone else, she was just being careful. To her, it was something else entirely. The habit of someone who understood what it meant to protect. Days turned into a week. The air grew hotter and the cicadas screamed through the afternoons. One night, lightning flashed far off on the horizon. The wind shifted, bringing with it the smell of rain and something else. Something faint like engine oil. Evelyn stood on her porch, looking out across the field. Her heart was steady. The land was quiet again, but the kind of quiet that hides movement. She could almost feel it in her bones, the sense that something was coming closer. She turned and walked back inside, her steps slow and sure. The wooden floor creaked under her boots. She paused by the old cabinet in the hallway, her hand brushing over the door. For a moment, her reflection in the glass looked younger, stronger, the woman she once was. Then she smiled softly, shook her head and went to bed. That night, she dreamed of open fields, faraway thunder, and a long, calm breath before the first shot. The next morning, the rooster didn't crow. The air was still, heavy like a held breath. Evelyn stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the edge of the woods again. She didn't need to see movement this time. She could feel it, deep down the way old instincts whisper before words can. The farm, her quiet refuge, was no longer just a home. It had become a line she would not let anyone cross. She turned her gaze to the road, her expression calm, her eyes steady. Whatever was coming, she would be ready, not because she wanted a fight, but because she'd spent a lifetime learning how to end one before it began. And so, the quiet farm waited under the wide Mississippi sky for a storm that was only just beginning to form beyond the trees. Rain came late that night. It started soft, tapping against the roof and the windows like someone knocking gently to be let in. Evelyn sat by the kitchen table watching the drops run down the glass. The sound was steady, calm, and familiar. She'd always liked rain. It made the world slow down, but tonight she couldn't relax. She had gone through her usual evening routine, checked the barn, fed the animals, and locked every door. Yet something about the quiet outside felt different. The kind of quiet that had a weight to it, as if the land itself was waiting for something to happen. Her old dog, a mutt with gray fur and a limp in his leg, lay by her feet. He lifted his head now and then, ears twitching at sounds she couldn't hear. Evelyn reached down and rubbed behind his ears, whispering softly, "It's all right, boy. Just the rain." Still, she didn't fully believe her own words. The radio on the counter crackled with static. A man's voice came through, reporting another farm break-in 2 towns over. Same story. Tools gone, fuel missing, and nobody caught. Evelyn listened quietly, then turned the radio off. She stared at her reflection in the dark window. The face looking back at her was lined but strong. Those eyes, steady, calm, knowing, belonged to someone who had lived through much worse than thieves. She stood, walked to the hallway, and opened the old wooden cabinet. Inside, under a pile of folded quilts, was a small metal box. She lifted it gently and set it on the table. The box was scratched and faded, its corners worn smooth from years of handling. When she opened it, a faint smell of oil and thyme drifted out. Inside was a small collection of items: a worn photograph, a military medal, and a thin leather strap tied around a set of tags. Beneath those lay a folded cloth bundle. She unwrapped it carefully, her hands moving with the confidence of muscle memory. The rifle inside gleamed faintly under the kitchen light. It had been cleaned and cared for, even though it hadn't seen daylight in years. She ran her hand along the barrel, then set it back in the cloth. She didn't need it tonight, not yet. But just knowing it was ready brought her a strange kind of peace. She put everything back, closed the cabinet, and locked it again. Then she sat down, folded her hands, and prayed quietly. Outside, the rain grew heavier. The wind pushed against the house, making the shutters rattle. The dog stood suddenly, ears alert, staring toward the door. Evelyn froze, listening. At first, she heard only the rain, then a faint crunch of gravel. Her heart didn't race. It just steadied itself like it always had when she needed to stay calm. She walked to the window and looked out. Through the thin sheet of rain, she could make out 2 headlights faint and far down the road. The vehicle wasn't moving fast. It had slowed near her driveway. She turned off the lamp, letting the house fall into soft darkness. The only light came from the glow of the moon behind the clouds. From the window, she watched the headlights stop. The engine idled for a few seconds, then went silent. No one got out. Minutes passed, long and heavy. The rain pattered against the roof. The clock ticked softly on the wall, and still she watched. Finally, the engine started again. The headlights swung across the field as the truck turned and drove off. Evelyn didn't move. She stayed at the window until the sound faded completely, then went to the door and checked the lock again. Only after that did she sit back down. "Just testing the road," she whispered, though she knew better. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a low mist that hugged the fields. Evelyn put on her boots and went outside. The ground was soft and muddy, her boots sinking with every step. She followed the gravel road toward the gate and stopped when she saw them. Fresh tire tracks. She crouched down, tracing one with her fingers. They were deep, like someone had parked there for a while. She stood slowly, looking out over the field. In the distance near the barn, a crow landed on the fence post and cawed loudly. The sound echoed across the wet grass. That day she worked as usual, though her mind was elsewhere. When Henry came by in the afternoon to drop off some corn feed, he noticed her quiet mood. "You all right out here by yourself, Miss Evelyn?" he asked, leaning on the porch rail. "Folks still talking about those break-ins." She smiled faintly. "I'm fine, Henry, always have been. You let me know if you see anything strange, all right?" "I will." But they both knew she wouldn't. That evening, after Henry left, she cooked a small dinner: cornbread, greens, and beans. She ate by the window, watching the sky darken over the hills. The air was still and heavy again, like the night before. As the first stars appeared, she heard a distant sound. Not the wind, not the animals, something mechanical. Slow at first, then stopping. Her old dog started growling softly. Evelyn turned off the lamp and stood by the window. The same faint glow of headlights appeared down the road. This time closer, The truck stopped by her fence again. The lights went out, but the engine didn't. She stood there unmoving, her face calm. Whoever was out there, they were bold enough to come back 2 nights in a row. Minutes passed. Then the sound of the engine faded again, the truck backing away and driving off into the dark. Evelyn didn't sleep that night. At dawn, she walked out to the road again. The tracks were deeper this time, and near the gate she found something else. A cigarette butt still smelling faintly of smoke. She crushed it under her boot and stood for a long moment staring at the horizon. The peace of her land was being disturbed, and she didn't like it, not because she was afraid, but because it broke the quiet she'd worked so hard to build. For the next few days she made small changes around the farm. She stacked wooden crates behind the barn door, moved her tools to a locked shed, and set up a few lanterns around the porch. To anyone else it might have looked like normal chores. To her it was quiet preparation. Every night she stayed up later listening. She started sleeping in the chair by the window instead of her bed. The dog stayed close by her side, sometimes lifting his head, sometimes just breathing quietly. Then came the night the rain didn't fall. The air was warm and still, the kind of air that carried sound easily. The moon was hidden behind clouds and the sky was black as ink. Evelyn sat in her chair, the rifle now resting across her lap. She hadn't loaded it. It was just there, the weight of it comforting, familiar. Around midnight she heard it, a gate creaking open. She froze, listening. The sound was faint, but she knew it wasn't her imagination. Then came the crunch of footsteps on gravel, slow, careful steps. Her hand tightened slightly on the rifle's grip, but her breathing stayed even. The dog growled once, low and quiet. The steps paused near the porch. She could see a faint shadow move past the window, then another, 2, maybe 3 people. They whispered to each other, voices too soft to understand. One of them laughed, a quick, nervous laugh. Evelyn stayed still. She didn't move or make a sound. The shadows moved again, heading toward the barn. The old wooden doors creaked softly, then fell quiet. She could hear them inside now, murmuring, moving things. It sounded like they were checking for tools or fuel. She stood slowly, careful not to make noise, and walked to the back window. From there, she could see the outline of the barn through the trees. A faint light flickered inside, a flashlight beam moving around. She watched for a while, noting their movements. They weren't here for her house yet. They were testing the place, seeing how close they could get. Finally, after what felt like an hour, the light went out. The door closed again and the shadows slipped back toward the road. The truck engine started. The headlights came on just long enough to make a quick turn before disappearing into the night. Evelyn exhaled slowly, set the rifle down, and stroked the dog's head. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "Next time they won't just look." The next morning she went to the barn to see what they had done. A few tools were missing, a gas can too. But it wasn't the loss that bothered her. It was the message. They had tested her, and now they knew she lived alone. She stood there in the barn doorway, the light falling over her face. Her expression didn't change, but inside her thoughts were sharp and clear. She knew the type. Young, reckless, sure the world owed them something. They'd think she was just an old woman with no one around to help. They'd think her quiet meant weakness. She almost smiled. They had no idea who they were dealing with. That afternoon, she drove to town. She bought a few supplies, nails, extra locks, new batteries for her lanterns. She didn't tell anyone why. People greeted her like they always did, and she greeted them back the same way. By the time she returned home, the sun was setting again. The light turned everything orange and soft. She stood by the porch for a moment, breathing in the smell of the fields. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even nervous. She just knew that her quiet life had reached a turning point. The land she'd loved for years had always protected her. Now it was her turn to protect it. That night she cleaned the rifle carefully, checking every part. Her movements were steady, practiced. The kind of calm that comes from knowing what you're doing and why you're doing it. When she was done, she looked out the window once more. The night stretched wide and silent, but this time she didn't just see darkness. She saw every corner, every path, every shadow. She knew exactly where she would stand if anyone dared step foot on her land again. And somewhere, deep inside, she felt that quiet readiness return. The same strength she'd once carried through war and hardship. It wasn't something she'd lost with age. It had only been waiting, buried under years of peace. Now, it was awake again. Evelyn turned off the lamp, sat down and waited for morning. The farm slept, but she did not. The sun rose slowly over the fields, turning the wet grass into gold. Evelyn stood by the porch, her coffee steaming in her hands, watching the mist lift from the ground. The air was quiet, the kind of quiet that seemed almost too perfect. Birds sang in the trees, the rooster crowed late as always, and everything looked normal. But she knew better. The signs were still there, the broken gate, the missing tools, the deep tire marks by the fence. Someone had been testing her patience and her space. She could feel that something bigger was coming, something that would decide if she kept the peace she had worked so hard to build. She didn't tell anyone. That wasn't her way. Evelyn believed in handling things quietly, without fuss. She had spent a lifetime depending on her own strength, and she wasn't about to change now. She finished her coffee, fed the chickens, and checked her crops like always. But her mind was sharp, alert to every sound. All through the day, she noticed small things, branches broken near the edge of the woods, a strange glint of metal by the road, the faint smell of gasoline on the wind. None of it was enough to prove anything, but her instincts told her all she needed to know. They were watching. By the time the sun dipped low behind the trees, she had a plan forming. She didn't believe in waiting for trouble to find her. If it came, she'd meet it with calm and purpose. She walked to the old barn, her boots crunching on dry dirt. Inside, the air smelled of hay and wood oil. Dust floated in the slanted beams of light coming through the cracks in the wall. She checked the doors, the hinges, and the back window. Everything seemed fine, but she tightened the locks anyway. Then she stood still for a while, listening to the echo of her own breathing. It was in that stillness that she remembered another kind of quiet, the one from years ago, in a place far away. The way the world went silent before something dangerous, the way she used to feel every shift of the air, every vibration in the ground. Those memories didn't scare her. They steadied her. After closing up the barn, she went back to the house and cooked herself a simple dinner. The dog lay at her feet as she ate, his tail thumping gently now and then. She turned the radio on low, listening to an old blues tune hum softly through the static. Then the announcer's voice broke in. Another report of rural thefts, this time not far from her county line. She turned the volume down, her eyes narrowing slightly. She could feel it now. They were moving closer. That night the sky was clear. The moon hung high and bright, washing the fields in pale silver. Evelyn sat by the window with the lights off, her chair angled so she could see the yard and the road. The rifle rested beside her, not out of fear but readiness. Hours passed. The only sounds were crickets and the rustle of the trees. She almost let her mind drift when she heard it, a faint, low hum. An engine. It grew louder, then stopped near the road. Her heart stayed steady. She leaned slightly, careful not to move the curtain too much. Through the glass, she saw the same truck she'd seen before, dark, old, with its lights off this time. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then she saw shapes, 4 of them, moving across the field. They were quiet, trying to use the moonlight to see without giving themselves away. Evelyn didn't move. She just watched. They split up at the fence, 2 heading toward the barn, 1 to the shed and 1 staying near the road. Their movements were quick and confident, like they'd done this before. She could almost hear their voices in the wind, low and hurried. They thought she was asleep. They thought this was going to be easy. Evelyn reached over and touched the rifle, her hand gentle on the barrel. She didn't lift it, didn't even unlock the safety. She wasn't planning on harm. But she wanted them to know she wasn't defenseless. The dog beside her lifted his head and let out a soft growl. Evelyn reached down and whispered, "Hush, boy. Not yet." She stood quietly and moved through the house, every step measured. Years of discipline kept her from making a single sound. She moved like someone who had done this 100 times before, someone who knew how to wait. She reached the back room, where a narrow window looked out toward the barn. The faint light of flashlights flickered inside. They were in there now, rummaging through her things again. She took a deep breath and thought about her next move. There was no reason to rush. She knew the land better than anyone. She could see in her mind exactly where each of them stood, where they would go next. Her voice was steady as she spoke softly to herself. "You've had your warning." She turned away from the window, her eyes calm. She walked to the kitchen, filled the kettle with water, and set it on the stove. The small click of the gas made her dog's ears perk up. It was a strange thing, but the act of making tea steadied her more than anything else. She wasn't reacting with fear. She was preparing. Outside, one of the barn doors creaked again. Then another noise, a faint thud as if someone had dropped something metal. She knew they'd hear the dog next if he barked, so she kept a hand on his collar, whispering softly to keep him calm. The minutes stretched. She could hear them moving again, this time closer. The one who'd stayed near the road must have joined the others, because she could now make out 3 sets of faint footsteps coming from the direction of the barn. They were headed toward the house. Evelyn's eyes moved to the window again. The moonlight made the field glow faintly. She saw one shadow break from the rest, crouching low, moving toward her porch. Her pulse stayed even. She turned off the stove before the kettle could whistle, letting the kitchen fall silent again. Then she walked toward the front room, her bare feet quiet on the old wooden floor. She knew every creak of this house, every board that complained under weight. Through the window, she saw the figure reach the bottom of her porch steps. The man hesitated for a moment, glancing back toward the barn. Then he took another step forward. Evelyn didn't move to the door. Instead, she reached for the light switch near the window. With a single motion, she flipped it on. The porch light flooded the front of the house, bright and sudden. The man froze, one hand halfway to his belt. From inside, Evelyn stood in the doorway, her silhouette calm and straight. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The message was clear. For a moment, everything was still. Then the man turned and ran, shouting something toward the others. The sound of feet pounding against dirt filled the night. A truck door slammed. The engine roared to life, tires spinning in the gravel as they sped away. Evelyn watched the headlights fade down the road until the darkness swallowed them again. Then she switched the light off and stood in silence for a long while. Her hands were steady. Her breathing never changed. Finally, she looked down at the dog, who wagged his tail once as if asking if it was over. "Not yet," she said softly. "They'll be back. People like that always come back." The next morning, the sheriff stopped by after hearing from someone down the road who'd seen a truck speeding away late in the night. He asked if she was all right. Evelyn told him everything was fine, that she'd just had a late night with the lights on and maybe someone got spooked. The sheriff didn't press. He knew her well enough to trust her word. Still, he promised to drive by more often just to check in. She thanked him politely, though she knew she wouldn't need it. After he left, she spent the day mending fences again. But this time she added a few changes, a few quiet precautions. By evening, she'd placed a bell on the front gate, one that would ring if it opened. She'd also hung an old lantern above the barn door, not lit but ready if she needed it. When the sun went down, she sat on the porch, rocking slowly, the air cool and still around her. The stars came out one by one, and she listened to the sounds of the night, the distant frogs, the crickets, the soft rustle of leaves. She didn't think about fear. She thought about patience. She thought about how the world tested people over and over to see if they'd stand or fold. She had already decided. As the hours passed, her eyes grew heavy, but she didn't sleep. Around midnight, the sound came again, the low hum of a truck in the distance. This time, she didn't go inside. She stayed on the porch, her hand resting on her knee, waiting. The headlights appeared down the road, moving slower than before. The truck stopped just beyond the gate. The engine idled. Evelyn could see faint movement, shadows behind the glass. They were watching the house, waiting to see if the light would come on. It didn't. She sat quietly, her face calm, her gaze steady. After several long minutes, the truck backed up and drove off again. Evelyn stayed there until the sound was gone. Then she stood, stretched her legs, and whispered into the night. "You'll learn." She turned and went inside, closing the door behind her. By dawn, she was up again, tending to her chores as if nothing had happened. The morning sun poured through the kitchen window, warm and golden. The farm looked peaceful again, but she knew that peace was something you had to guard carefully. Later that day, as she was gathering eggs, a neighbor stopped by to chat. He'd heard rumors about people prowling at night. Evelyn just smiled and said she hadn't seen anything unusual. After he left, she stood by the fence looking out across her land. Her heart felt steady. The fields, the trees, the barn, it was all part of her history, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that from her. When night came again, she lit a single lamp in the window, then turned it off before bed. The light was for her, not for them. A small reminder that she was still watching, still ready. The wind moved gently through the trees outside, carrying the scent of honeysuckle and distant rain. She closed her eyes, listening. The night felt different now, not full of fear, but full of purpose. Evelyn knew it was only a matter of time before they came again, and when they did, she would be prepared. Not with anger, but with the quiet strength of someone who had seen storms before and survived every one. And so, the old woman waited, not as prey, but as protector. The farm, once just her home, had become her ground of peace and defense. The wind whispered against the walls, and somewhere far off, thunder rolled softly. She smiled to herself, feeling that deep, unshakable calm settle over her again. The storm hadn't reached her yet, but she knew it was on its way. The night came quiet, heavy with the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. The sky stretched wide and dark above the old farm, and the moon hid behind thick clouds. The air felt different, charged in a way Evelyn hadn't felt in years. She knew the feeling well. It was the same quiet that came before something changed forever. All day she had felt it coming. The wind blew from the east instead of the south, carrying the faint scent of exhaust and something metallic. The birds hadn't sung that morning. Even the animals seemed uneasy, shifting and pacing in their pens. The old dog wouldn't leave her side. Evelyn had spent the afternoon preparing without thinking about it much. She filled water pails, brought the chickens into the coop, locked the barn doors, and made sure every tool was in its place. It was a habit now, moving through each task with quiet purpose. When the sun started to sink, she stood by the porch for a long time, watching the light fade across her land. This place had been her whole world for decades. Every fence post, every path through the tall grass held a piece of her story. She had lived a lifetime here, laughed, mourned, worked, rebuilt. And now it felt like the farm itself was holding its breath beside her. When the sky finally turned black, she went inside and lit a single lantern. The warm glow reached only partway across the room, leaving the corners in soft shadow. She brewed a pot of coffee and sat down by the table, hands wrapped around the cup, listening to the soft ticking of the clock. She wasn't afraid, not even a little. She'd seen worse nights than this. She'd seen chaos and storms and silence that could drive weaker hearts to panic. This was just another test, and she would meet it like she always had, steady and sure. Around 10, she turned the lantern down low and moved to the window. The yard was washed in moonlight again now that the clouds had drifted. The trees cast long shadows, stretching like dark fingers across the field. Everything looked still. Then she saw it, the faint beam of headlights far down the road. They were back. Evelyn's hand rested lightly against the window frame. She didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. The headlights came closer, then slowed as they reached the fence line. The vehicle stopped, its engine idling softly. For a moment, she thought maybe they'd just sit there like before, testing her patience. But then the engine cut off and 4 shadows stepped out. The men stood close together, talking quietly. Their voices didn't carry clearly, just bits of sound caught on the wind. They moved with purpose, not like lost travelers, but like people who knew exactly where they were headed. Evelyn's dog gave a low growl. She reached down and touched his head. "Stay close, boy," she whispered. She turned away from the window and walked to the hallway where the old wooden cabinet stood. Her movements were slow, careful. She opened the door and reached for the rifle she hadn't touched since the night before. It was already clean and oiled, ready. She didn't take it to threaten anyone. She took it because it was part of her, a tool she understood better than most people understand themselves. She'd carried one like it through days when the sun was unforgiving and nights when the world went silent except for her heartbeat. Now, it was simply what she needed to feel steady. She carried it with her as she walked back to the front room. The moonlight through the window made her face look calm, carved with lines of time and strength. Her eyes were clear, her breathing even. Outside, the shadows moved closer. One of them crossed the fence easily, another followed. The third went toward the barn again. The fourth hung back near the truck. They were organized this time. Evelyn stood by the window, half hidden behind the curtain. She could see their outlines moving against the silver light. They walked low, slow, the way people do when they think they're smarter than their surroundings. She watched as one reached the barn door and tried to pull it open. It didn't budge. He pulled harder. Still nothing. Then the faint sound of whispered frustration drifted through the night. The one near the porch motioned toward the house, and the others began to move that way. Evelyn stepped back from the window and set the rifle against the wall beside her. She wasn't planning on using it, not unless she had no choice, but she wanted it close. She took a slow breath and looked around the room. The old clock ticked steadily on the mantel. The lantern flame flickered gently. Outside, the footsteps grew closer, crunching softly against the gravel. When the first shadow reached the steps, the dog barked once, sharp and loud. The men froze. Evelyn let the silence stretch. Then she reached for the lantern, turned the flame higher, and opened the front door. The sudden light spilled out onto the porch, cutting through the dark. She stood there, framed by the doorway, her figure still and upright. "Can I help you?" she said, her voice steady, clear enough to carry across the yard. For a moment, no one answered. She could see their faces now, young, uncertain, surprised. They hadn't expected her to be awake, hadn't expected her to speak. "We're just passing through," one of them said quickly, his voice low. "Didn't mean no trouble." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Then you shouldn't be sneaking around my barn in the middle of the night." Another man muttered something she couldn't quite catch. The first one tried to smile, but it looked forced. "We just got lost, ma'am. Thought this was a different road." Her eyes stayed on them, sharp but calm. "You found the wrong farm to get lost on." The words hung in the air. None of them moved. The wind rustled through the grass, brushing past the porch steps. The moment stretched long and thin. Finally, one of them stepped back, nudging the others. "Come on, let's go," he said quietly. Evelyn didn't move until they'd crossed back through the fence. She stood there watching as they climbed into the truck. The engine started with a cough, then roared as they sped off down the road. Only after the sound faded did she close the door. Inside, the house felt warm again. The lantern's glow flickered softly against the walls. She set the rifle back by the cabinet and ran a hand over her face. It was over, for now. But she knew what this meant. They hadn't come all this way to leave empty-handed. They'd be back, maybe not tonight, but soon. And next time they wouldn't bother talking first. The next morning, the world looked almost peaceful. The sun rose bright and golden, the field swaying gently under the breeze. But Evelyn moved through her chores differently now. Every sound made her look twice. Every passing car drew her eyes toward the road. In town, people talked again about thefts, about strange men being seen near the highway. When Evelyn stopped for supplies, the store clerk mentioned it. "You be careful out there," she said kindly. "Seems like some folks don't respect other people's property anymore." Evelyn smiled softly. "Don't worry about me," she said. "I've been careful all my life." Back at the farm, she worked until dusk. The rhythm of her movements kept her calm, mending, fixing, preparing. The land had always taken care of her, and now she would return the favor. As the sky turned orange, she sat on the porch, sipping sweet tea, watching the horizon darken. The old dog lay at her feet, tail twitching in his sleep. She listened to the night sounds returning, the crickets, the frogs, the whisper of the trees. But beneath all that, she could hear it, the faint hum of the world holding its breath again. Evelyn set her cup down and stood. She looked across the open field toward the tree line, her eyes narrowing. She didn't see movement this time, but she felt it, the same quiet watchfulness she'd felt before danger years ago. The same instinct that had kept her alive when others hadn't been so lucky. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "All right," she whispered. "If you're coming, I'll be ready." Inside the house, she turned off the lights, letting darkness settle naturally. She opened a window to listen better, her senses sharp. She didn't need to see to know what was happening beyond her walls. She could feel it in her bones, the earth shifting, the air tightening. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. The night stretched long and heavy. Then, at last, she heard it again. The truck. This time it didn't stop by the road. The engine cut off right outside the fence. The gate creaked softly as it opened, and she heard footsteps, several moving quickly. Her pulse didn't change. She stood in the middle of the living room, calm as still water. The rifle leaned against the wall beside her, untouched. The footsteps drew closer. She could hear whispers, the faint sound of boots scraping against the porch. Then, silence. She reached over and turned on the lantern again, the light flooding the room. Outside, the porch boards creaked. She could see shadows through the thin curtains. Someone was right outside the door. Evelyn took a step forward, her hand on the door handle. Then she paused, looked toward the window. and noticed something. A flash of red light far down the road. A car, the sheriff's cruiser. She had called earlier that day quietly, asking him to check in after dark, just in case. The red light reflected faintly on the metal of the truck by the fence. The shadows outside hesitated. One of them whispered sharply, then footsteps retreated fast, boots hitting gravel, the sound of an engine starting again. The sheriff's car turned up the road as the truck sped away in the other direction. Evelyn opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the lantern light glowing behind her. The night was full of movement now, the sound of engines fading, the quiet rustle of the wind returning. The sheriff pulled up a moment later, getting out with a flashlight in hand. "You all right, Miss Evelyn?" he called. She nodded once. "I'm fine. They're gone." He looked around, shining the light across the yard. Saw them heading toward the main road. "I'll get a deputy out there to follow up." Evelyn gave a small smile. "Don't trouble yourself too much. They got the message." The sheriff studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You always were a strong one." When he drove off again, the farm grew quiet once more. The crickets returned and the stars blinked faintly above. Evelyn stood on the porch, breathing in the cool air, her shoulders finally relaxing. The danger had passed for now, and her land was still hers, untouched, standing firm. She went back. Inside, turned down the lantern and looked out one last time through the window. The field stretched wide under the moonlight, calm and familiar again. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the scent of peace. She smiled faintly, whispering to herself, "That's how it's done." Then she sat down, the rifle resting quietly by the door, and waited for morning. The next morning broke slow and gentle. The first light came creeping through the thin curtains, brushing against the wooden walls of the small farmhouse. Birds began to sing again, cautious at first, then stronger as the sun rose higher. The world outside looked peaceful, as if the night before had been only a bad dream. Evelyn woke before dawn, as she always did. She lay still for a few moments, listening to the quiet rhythm of her home, the soft ticking of the clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the steady breathing of the dog at her bedside. It was the sound of safety. It was the sound she had fought to keep. She sat up slowly, her back stiff but strong. The years had left their marks, but they hadn't taken her will. She pulled on her old work shirt and boots, brushed her hair back, and went to the kitchen. The smell of coffee filled the air soon after, rich and familiar. She stepped onto the porch with her mug in hand. The sun was just peeking over the trees, painting everything gold. The fields stretched out wide and bright, the dew catching the light like tiny sparks. For a moment she just stood there, feeling the warmth touch her face. It was a new day. The night before had been long and heavy, but she didn't feel shaken. If anything, she felt calm. The land was still hers. Her peace was still intact, and she had handled things the way she knew best, with steady hands and clear thought. The sheriff had come by again at sunrise. His truck rumbled up the drive, stopping near the porch. He got out with a notebook in his hand and a tired smile on his face. "Morning, Miss Evelyn," he said. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," she replied. "I was already up." He nodded and looked out toward the road. "We found that truck about 6 miles out, abandoned. Looks like they ran off on foot. We'll find them sooner or later." Evelyn didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. The sheriff could handle it. She'd already done her part. He looked at her again and said quietly, "You sure you're all right out here alone?" She smiled faintly. "I've been alone a long time. Don't worry about me." He hesitated, then tipped his hat. "All right then, just know we're keeping an eye on things." When he left, the gravel crunched under his tires, and then the sound faded away. Evelyn turned back to her porch chair and sat down again. The dog settled beside her, resting his head on her foot. She took another sip of coffee and stared out across the open field. The morning light had turned brighter now, the kind that made everything look alive again. She felt something inside her ease, something that had been wound tight for days, maybe even for years. For the first time in a long while, she thought about the life she'd lived, not the one people saw now, but the one buried in memory. There had been a time when she was known for her skill, her precision, her calm under pressure. It had been another world back then. The noise, the orders, the chaos that never seemed to end. She'd done her duty, quietly and effectively, but when she came home, she left it all behind. Or at least she thought she had. But standing in that same stillness now, she realized that part of her had never really left. It had only gone quiet, waiting for the day she might need it again. Last night had proved that some instincts never fade. Still, she wasn't proud of what had happened. Pride wasn't the right word for it. She was simply thankful. Thankful that no one was hurt. Thankful that her home was safe. Thankful that she still had the strength to protect what mattered. Later that morning, a few neighbors stopped by. Word had spread fast, as it always did in small towns. A pickup pulled up near the gate, and two men got out carrying tools and fence posts. "Heard you had some trouble," one of them said. "We figured we'd help you fix that fence." Evelyn didn't argue. She simply nodded her thanks and watched as they worked. Another neighbor brought a basket of cornbread and fresh milk, setting it gently on the porch. "You're a strong woman," she said. "Always have been. But it doesn't hurt to let folks lend a hand now and then." Evelyn smiled. "I'll keep that in mind." As the day went on, more people came, some just to talk, some to make sure she was truly all right. She appreciated it, even if she didn't say much. It reminded her that, even though she lived far out and kept mostly to herself, she wasn't entirely alone. By afternoon, the farm looked whole again. The broken boards were replaced, the barn door fixed, the fence reinforced. Everything stood the way it had before, maybe even stronger. When everyone finally left, she walked the property one last time, checking each corner. She paused near the old oak tree at the edge of the field, where the wind rustled through the leaves. It was quiet there, peaceful. The world had settled again, just as it always did after a storm. That night she sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky turned shades of orange and pink, fading slowly into purple. The dog lay curled at her feet, snoring softly. Fireflies began to appear in the tall grass, blinking like tiny lanterns. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her hands folded loosely in her lap. She thought about how life had changed, not just for her but for the world around her. People didn't seem to value quiet anymore. Everything was noise, rush, distraction. But she had learned that peace wasn't something you found by running from the world. It was something you built, piece by piece, fence by fence, moment by moment, and protected with steady hands when the time came. She thought of her late husband, how they used to sit together on this same porch watching the stars. He'd always said the land had a soul, that if you took care of it, it would take care of you. She smiled softly at the memory. He had been right. The land had taken care of her in its own way, and she had done the same for it. The moon rose, silver and calm. The wind moved gently through the crops, whispering through the corn like a lullaby. She could feel the rhythm of the earth again, slow and strong. She looked toward the road where the sheriff's car had driven away that morning and whispered to herself, "It's all settled now." She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. Days turned into weeks after that night. Life went back to its usual rhythm, feeding the animals, tending the garden, repairing whatever needed mending. The seasons shifted little by little, the air growing cooler, the evenings shorter. Sometimes, she would hear cars on the road and she would pause for a moment listening, but none ever stopped again. Whoever those men were, they had learned their lesson. The farm had its own quiet reputation now. People in town started calling her Granny Eagle Eye, a name that made her shake her head with half a laugh. She hadn't asked for that title, but she understood why it had stuck. Folks liked stories, especially ones that made them feel safe. She never bragged or told her version. When people asked, she just smiled and said, "I did what needed to be done." Sometimes younger folks from town would stop by just to talk. They'd ask her for advice about the land or life or how to stay calm when things went wrong. She'd listen more than she spoke, and when she did speak, it was in that slow, measured way that carried weight. One evening as the sun went down, a young woman who often brought groceries came by. "People talk about you like you're some kind of legend," she said shyly. "Is it true you were a sniper once?" Evelyn chuckled softly, her eyes glinting. "I did my part, that's all." The young woman looked impressed. "Well, you sure did more than most would." Evelyn smiled and handed her a jar of honey from the kitchen shelf. "Take this home. It's good for the soul." The girl thanked her and left, but Evelyn stayed on the porch long after, watching the horizon fade into dusk. She didn't think of herself as a legend. Legends were stories told about people who were gone. She was still here, still living, still waking up every morning to feed her animals and watch the sun rise over her land. She was just a woman who had lived long enough to understand that life is made of small moments that test you, and that how you face them says everything. Late that night, when the farm was quiet again and the stars shone bright above, she went out to the porch one last time. The air was cool, the kind that carried the scent of grass and wood smoke. She sat down with her old rifle resting beside her, not as a weapon, but as a reminder. A piece of her story, a part of who she was, the strong, steady soul who refused to be afraid of the dark. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled, and the sound rolled across the open land. Evelyn smiled faintly. "Good night," she whispered as if to the land itself, and for the first time in a long while she felt completely at peace. The next morning came bright and still. She woke to the sound of the rooster and the smell of coffee brewing. The sky outside her window was painted in soft shades of pink and blue. The world kept turning. The land kept growing, and she kept living, quietly, simply, bravely. The story of the night when strangers came and found something they didn't expect would travel far beyond her little town. But for her, it was never about fame or fear. It was about home, about the soil beneath her feet and the memories that lived there. As she stepped onto the porch again, her dog wagged his tail beside her, and the day stretched open wide before her. She smiled softly, taking in the endless horizon. Everything she had ever needed was right there, and that was enough. The seasons turned again. The summer heat slowly gave way to the cool breath of fall, and Evelyn's farm began to glow in soft colors: golden fields, orange leaves, and skies painted with fading sunlight. Each morning felt quieter now, not empty, but peaceful in the kind of way that comes after long storms have passed. Her days fell back into rhythm, the kind of rhythm she trusted. Feed the chickens, sweep the porch, pick what was ready in the garden, check the fence lines. The little things filled her time, and that was all she ever really needed. She'd learned that life wasn't built out of grand moments. It was the small, steady ones that kept you going. The people in town still talked about her sometimes. Every few weeks, someone new would drive by slow, just to get a look at the old woman who had scared off those thieves. She could feel the eyes watching from the road now and then, but she didn't mind. If anything, it amused her. She never corrected their stories. Folks liked to make things bigger than they were. In town, they said she had chased the men off with just her voice. Others said she'd trapped them somehow, outsmarted them without firing a shot. The truth, she figured, was somewhere in between. Quiet, simple, and not nearly as exciting. Sometimes, when she'd go to the market, people would whisper kindly, "That's her." She'd just smile, hand over her vegetables, and move on. She didn't need to remind anyone who she was. One chilly morning, as she stacked jars of honey on her table at the market, a man she didn't recognize came by. He was middle-aged, wearing a work jacket and carrying a small notebook. He smiled politely. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm writing a piece about local heroes for the county paper. Folks keep telling me about you. I'd like to include your story if that's all right." Evelyn gave him a small nod. People sure do talk a lot, don't they? He laughed lightly. "They do. But this one's worth telling." She looked down at her table for a moment before replying. "You can tell it how you like. Just remember, I'm no hero. I just protected my home." He smiled again, respectful. "That's exactly what makes it worth telling." When the article came out a week later, it was simple. Just a short piece with a photo of her standing by her porch, holding a jar of honey. The headline read, "Local woman teaches the meaning of courage and calm." She didn't think much of it. But the next Sunday at church, more people than usual came to shake her hand. A few even brought gifts, pies, canned peaches, a scarf. It made her heart warm, though she didn't say so out loud. She had never done well with attention. All she'd ever wanted was to live quietly and keep her peace. After service, the pastor came up to her. "You've inspired a lot of folks," he said kindly. "Sometimes it just takes one steady soul to remind people what strength really looks like." She smiled softly. "Strength's not loud. It's just knowing what you stand for." He nodded in agreement. That night back at the farm, she sat on her porch again, looking up at the stars. The air was crisp, the kind that smelled like dry leaves and distant wood smoke. The sky stretched wide above her, filled with the quiet hum of autumn. She thought of how much had changed, not just in the past months, but over a lifetime. She had outlived friends, family, even most of her old memories. Yet the land had stayed. It was her constant companion, her witness. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, she could almost hear echoes of old laughter, her husband's deep voice, the sound of neighbors talking across the fields, the ring of hammers and saws from when the barn was first built. Time faded people away, but it never erased their presence completely. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and whispered to the night, "We sure made it far, didn't we?" The dog lifted his head and wagged his tail once before settling again. The next morning, frost covered the ground. It glittered like glass in the early sunlight. Evelyn stepped carefully down the porch steps, her breath forming soft clouds in the cold air. She walked to the barn, checked the animals, and then spent most of the day patching up small things around the house. While working, she found an old wooden box tucked away on a high shelf in the pantry. Dust covered it thick, and she had to wipe it clean before lifting the lid. Inside were small pieces of her past, letters from her husband, old photographs, a medal or two from the years she rarely spoke about. She sat down at the table, the box open in front of her, and traced her fingers along the edges of a faded picture. In it she was young, standing tall in her uniform, her eyes sharp and sure. For a moment she could smell the dry heat of distant lands, hear the sound of boots on dirt, the crackle of radios. It was a lifetime ago, but the memory came back so clear she almost smiled. She had once thought that part of her life was gone forever. But as she sat there, she realized it was never gone, just sleeping quietly in the back of her mind. She put the picture back gently, closed the box, and set it aside. Some memories didn't need to be forgotten. They just needed to rest. As winter settled in, the days grew shorter. The nights were longer, colder, but beautiful in their stillness. Evelyn spent more evenings by the fire, reading old books or mending clothes. Neighbors continued to check on her, especially when snow came. A young man from down the road began dropping off firewood each week. "Just making sure you're warm enough," he'd say with a grin. She'd thank him with a jar of honey or a loaf of bread, and he'd wave on his way out. She liked having those small exchanges, and no fuss, no noise, just the simple kindness of people looking out for each other. One evening, a knock came at her door. When she opened it, she found a small group of kids from the local school standing on the porch holding a stack of papers. Their teacher waited behind them. "We wrote essays about heroes," one of the girls said shyly, "and most of us picked you." Evelyn blinked, a little surprised. "Is that so?" "Yes, ma'am," the teacher said with a warm smile. "They wanted to thank you in person." The children handed her the papers, pages filled with careful handwriting and crayon drawings of her farm, her porch, her old dog. Some even drew her with angel wings or a cape, which made her laugh softly. She invited them inside for cookies she'd baked earlier. They sat in the warm kitchen, chatting about school and farm animals and the snow outside. The room filled with laughter and the smell of cinnamon. After they left, she sat by the window, reading through the essays one by one. Most were simple, written from young hearts trying to make sense of courage, but every word felt sincere. One line written by a boy no older than 10 stayed with her. "She's a hero because she didn't get scared. She just stayed calm and used what she knew." Evelyn folded that paper carefully and kept it in the box with her old photos. As spring came again, the world around her came alive. Wildflowers filled the fields, the trees bloomed pink and white, and the sound of bees returned to the air. Life went on, quietly, beautifully. She spent her mornings planting new rows in the garden and her afternoons sitting in the shade, shelling peas or reading. Sometimes she'd hum old songs, the kind her mother used to sing while cooking supper. One afternoon, the sheriff stopped by again. His hair had turned grayer since the last time she saw him. He sat on the porch steps sipping lemonade. "I think it's finally quiet around here," he said. "Haven't had any trouble reports in months." Evelyn smiled. "The land remembers peace if you give it time." He nodded, then glanced toward the field. "People still talk about that night, you know. Some folks say it changed how they think about things." She chuckled softly. Maybe it just reminded them not to take kindness for weakness. The sheriff laughed. "That's a good way to put it." When he left, she stood watching his truck disappear down the road. Then she turned back to her porch chair and sat again, feeling the afternoon sun warm her hands. The air smelled of soil and new life. The dog barked at a butterfly and then flopped back down beside her, content. Evelyn looked out across the open land and thought about everything that had happened. The fear, the courage, the quiet after. It all seemed like another story now, something that belonged to the past. But she knew it had changed her too. It had reminded her that even in old age, strength didn't fade. It just became quieter, more thoughtful. She had always believed that the land gave back what you gave it. Patience, care, respect. Now she knew that life did the same. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the world in gold, she whispered softly to herself, "This is home. Always will be." She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the hum of the world around her, the buzzing of bees, the creak of the porch wood, the steady heartbeat of the farm. For the rest of her days, Evelyn lived simply and peacefully. Her story became one that parents told their children, not as a tale of danger, but as one of wisdom and courage. And even after she was gone, people said that when you walked past her farm on a quiet night, you could still feel that same calm energy, that steady sense of watchfulness, like the land itself had learned to protect its peace the way she once did. Because some spirits don't fade. They just blend into the earth that raised them. And so under the endless sky and whispering fields, her legacy lived on, not in fear, not in fame, but in the quiet strength that others carried forward.